बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम। इन्ना अअतैनाकल कौसर फसल्लि लिरब्बिका वन्हर इन्न शानिअका हुवल अबतर। Welcome to the Grand Round series of Shifa International Hospital, Shifa Tamira Millat University. My name is Muhammad Amir. I am Professor of Surgery and Dean Faculty of Health Sciences, Shifa Tamira Millat University and Shifa International Hospital. So I welcome you all to this grand round of our General Surgical Department. And on behalf of the department, I'm going to invite our colleague, Dr. Muhammad Suhaib Khan. He is going to talk about surgical management of gastroesophageal reflux disease and hiatus hernia. This is a very important and emerging topic in terms of surgical management and renewed indication for surgery. So he is going to discuss the various aspects of indications and the management. Dr. Suhaib Khan is a fellow of College of Physicians of Surgeons of Pakistan. He is a trained general surgeon and he did his training and fellowships in esophagogastric and pancreatic surgery and upper GI and bariatric surgery. He passed the fellowship examination of European Board of Esophageal Cancer Surgery from Cologne, Frankfurt, Germany. So without taking any further time, I request Dr. Muhammad Suhaib Khan to start his presentation on the surgical management of GERD and hiatus hernia. So Dr. Suhaib Khan.
Thank you, Professor Amir. Assalamu alaikum. So we are going to start with our topic, and this is surgical management of GERD and hiatus hernia. So GERD, as we all know, that GERD is the disease in which we describe the symptoms or the mucosal damage that has occurred because of reflux of gastric contents into the esophagus. And GERD is an important disease in terms that it is a biggest factor that leads to a major leading cancer, especially in a developed world, and that is adenocarcinoma of the esophagus. Of course, other factors are also responsible, but GERD is the initial factor that leads to Barrett esophagus and then to adenocarcinoma, especially of gastroesophageal junction. So, as we all know that GERD is a very common condition, and almost every person has at least couple of episodes in their lifetime, and almost every 10% is having GERD. And even if the patient who are not symptomatic and who didn't have any symptoms of GERD throughout their life, and if endoscopy is done for any other reason, even on endoscopy, they may have esophagitis because of GERD. Still, they are not having the symptoms, but they are having the esophagitis. So if we accumulate all these percentages, then the figure rises very high. And studies also show that even up to 20% of esophagitis and Barrett esophagus, the people are asymptomatic. So there are distinct subgroups of GERD. People who are symptomatic for GERD, but when we send them for endoscopy, the endoscopy is negative. And then there are subset of people who are having esophagitis and they are having erosive reflux. And then there is subset of people who are having Barrett's esophagus. We all know Barrett esophagus when there is columnar lined esophagus because of long-term effects of acid contact with the esophageal mucosa. So the symptoms are very variable. There are three typical symptoms that the GERD people have, but they are not present in every patient. So the most common is heartburn, second is acid breath and regurgitation. Heartburn, we define heartburn like the central chest pain that is behind the sternum. And regurgitation is the perception that a patient has because of reflux of gastric content into oropharynx or into hypopharynx. Quite interestingly, many people have only atypical symptoms, that they don't have heartburn, but they have chest pain. And sometimes that chest pain may make myocardial infarction, but when these people are given proton pump inhibitors, their pain is relieved. Then they may have epigastric pain, they may have bloating, and there are extraesophageal manifestations, especially in pediatric age group and in elderly population, that they get repeated infection of respiratory tract like pneumonia. They may have bronchiectasis, they may have exacerbation of asthma, they may have tonsillitis, laryngitis, repeated throat clearing, and hoarseness of voice. So these manifestations are also sometimes found in GERD patients. So why this GERD happen? Actually, GERD is not a rule, but it is an exception to anti-reflux mechanism. And the aim of anti-reflux mechanism is that the gastric content should not go back into the esophagus. And that is provided by two important mechanisms. One is intrinsic esophageal mechanism, and one is extrinsic esophageal mechanism. So the intrinsic esophageal mechanism is solely dependent on the lower esophageal sphincter. Lower esophageal sphincter is just a physiological sphincter, and that is a high pressure zone. And because if it is working properly, then the gastric contents will not go back into the esophagus. As we all know that there is a pressure gradient of 10 mmHg between the abdominal part of esophagus or stomach and the thoracic part of esophagus. The abdominal esophagus is positive 5 mmHg and the thoracic esophagus is negative 5 mmHg. So different studies have been done, and the pathological reflux, it is found that the pathological reflux is due to three main mechanisms. One is transient lower esophageal sphincter relaxation, and they are present in 65% of patients with GERD. So these TLOSRs are nothing but they are just short-lived relaxations that happen when a patient is vomiting, a patient is burping, but they happen when they happen pathologically or excessively or for longer time. Then in these people we have GERD. Then is hypotensive lower esophageal sphincter. As I said, that lower esophageal sphincter is lower part of the esophagus, that is high pressure zone. If the basal tone of lower esophageal sphincter is decreased, then it again leads to GERD. And third is the transient increase in intra-abdominal pressure. Actually, when there is increase in intra-abdominal pressure, it leads to increased number of transient lower esophageal sphincter relaxation, and then it leads to GERD. Also, if there is increased intra-abdominal pressure and there is short length of esophagus, then it again leads to gastroesophageal junction, to GERD. The extrinsic mechanism is if a patient is not having any hiatus hernia, then the right crus of the diaphragm is snugly attached to the lower esophageal sphincter, and if we are doing dissection in a patient who is not having hiatus hernia, then it is very difficult to dissect off the right crus fibers from the lower esophageal sphincter, because it is provide its fibers decussate in the lower part of esophagus, and they provide again an important role in anti-reflux mechanism. Distal esophageal compression, if as I said that if the length of abdominal esophagus is less than 2 to 3 centimeter, so that shortened esophagus will lead to GERD. If there is increased length of esophagus, then because of intra-abdominal pressure, that area will be compressed and the stomach contents will not go back into the lower part of the esophagus. There is some partial role of acute angle of gastroesophageal junction, and if autopsies are done in dead people, then that angle is lost, and this shows that this acute angle is just provided by the tonic contraction of the crus of the diaphragm and from the oblique sling fibers of the cardia. Then there are some defense system intrinsically and extrinsically in the esophagus, and one is acid receptors. These acid receptors causes protection to the mucosa of the esophagus, even if the mucosal cells are exposed for 1 hour to the acidic reflux, they does not cause damage to the mucosal cell. And another is nociceptors that become activated, and with help of that, patient feels pain and he seeks medical advice, and that is also a protective mechanism that has been gifted by nature. So what are the risk factors for reflux? Inherited factors do not have a great role in reflux, although in hiatus hernia there are familial predispositions. And in the demographic factors, again, there is no change in any gender. Both male and females have equal chances of gastroesophageal reflux disease, although studies shows that in 6 decades or 5th decade, the chances of gastroesophageal reflux disease increases, and this is again because of the decreased acute angle of acute angle of gastroesophageal junction. Then there are lifestyle factors. These are smoking, alcohol, and obesity. Everyone know that these 3 factors lead to gastroesophageal reflux disease. The patient with renal disease, with cardiac diseases, with GI dysmotility syndromes, they also have gastroesophageal reflux disease. From surgical point of view, we must keep hiatus hernia as the #1 risk factor because it is present in 32% of those with esophagitis when endoscopies are done. And conversely, 2/3 of hiatal hernia patients do have features of GERD. So how we will investigate the patient with GERD and how we will diagnose them. So on basis of symptoms, we can diagnose GERD, but the studies shows that the sensitivity of only symptomatic diagnosis is not more than 60%. And also there are studies that shows somewhat more benefit of response to proton pump inhibitors. Those patients whose heartburns are relieved after proton pumps inhibitor, their sensitivity for GERD is like 70%, but it is a bit lower than pH studies. Endoscopy is always the first line investigation, although as we discussed earlier that there may be patients who are endoscopically negative for GERD, but endoscopy is first line investigation because we have to rule out other pathologies and other sinister things like cancers at the gastroesophageal junction and gastric cancers. So contrast radiology again, contrast radiology does not have an important role in diagnosis of GERD only, although it can diagnose the complication of gastroesophageal reflux disease, and also we can rule out the motilities and problems of esophagus like achalasia, because sometimes achalasia also have symptoms similar to GERD. pH studies is traditionally been regarded as gold standard for diagnosis, but its sensitivity and specificity are not that perfect. So we must, if we are doing pH studies, we understand that pH studies are not done in a large number of centers, especially in Pakistan. So if these are done, then it is important to interpret the finding of pH according with the symptoms of the patients and along with endoscopic findings, because the catheter is sometimes placed higher in the esophagus, 5 centimeter above the gastroesophageal junction, or it may be lower in the stomach. So in both ways, it will give false values. So the most important test nowadays is esophageal impedance monitoring, and for that multi-channel intraluminal impedance studies are done, and these are done in combination with pH studies or in combination with manometry studies. So actually impedance is as we know that impedance is the resistance to the flow of current. So with help of it, we can differentiate between fluid refluxate or between air or gaseous refluxate. So it also tells us about the number of reflux. It also tells us about the proximal extent of the reflux, and whether the fluid is reflux or it was just the bolus that was given at the start of the test. And it can also, if it is combined with pH studies, then it can give details about whether the refluxate was alkaline or whether the refluxate was acidic. So manometry, as I told you, that manometry is done only to exclude the motor problems, for example, achalasia or diffuse esophageal spasm. So for GERD, we always start with medical treatment, and most of the patients are only treated with medicine throughout their life. And the initial step is that we take simple measures like not to take meal before going to bed, to raise the head end of the bed, and to, if the patient is obese, then he should do reduction of his weight, and to stop smoking, and to quit alcohol drinking. So these are the to avoid spicy meals. So these are the lifestyle modification, but these never work all time. So the first line medicine that are given in GERD patients are proton pump inhibitors like omeprazole, lansoprazole, pantoprazole, esomeprazole, and they are very effective in treating gastroesophageal reflux disease. And we all know that we all take proton pump inhibitor for treatment of gastroesophageal reflux disease. Then the second line treatment are H2 receptor antagonist like ranitidine, and prokinetic agent like cisapride. So surgical treatment, if we are going for surgical treatment of GERD, the principle of surgery for GERD is to create a mechanical anti-reflux barrier between esophagus and stomach, because that has been lost in patient with GERD. So our principle of surgery should be to create that mechanical anti-reflux barrier. And now, which set of the patients should have surgical treatment for GERD? Patient who fail to respond or partially respond only to PPIs. So failure to response means that they are taking adequate doses of PPIs like 20 to 40 mg daily and for adequate period of time, and even then they don't respond, then they are candidate for surgery. Then there are patients whose symptoms are fully controlled with PPIs, but they are of young age and they don't wish to take this medicine for their whole life. So they may also opt for surgery, and surgery should be advised or suggested in these subsets of people. Surgery has very good results in patients who have repeated respiratory complications, especially if they are having repeated pneumonias, they are having off and on visits to pulmonologist and taking antibiotics, or they are having repeated laryngitis or tonsillitis because of GERD, then these are the patients who get benefit from surgery. In Barrett esophagus, again, surgery is indicated if it is just metaplasia or it is low-grade dysplasia, because the long-term surveillance studies in patients with Barrett esophagus who have undergone fundoplication shows that there is definitive reduction in length of Barrett's esophagus. So whether only medical treatment should be done for GERD or surgical treatment, option of surgical treatment can be given to the patient. It is always an area of disagreement between gastroenterologists and surgeons. So this is one of the study, and this study was a bit biased study because that was done by a pharmaceutical company that provided that proton pump inhibitor. But this study reported that outcomes for further multi-center randomized trial of lab Nissen fundoplication versus esomeprazole. This trial was funded by pharmaceutical company, and it enrolled 554 patients, and outcomes at up to 3 years have been reported. And there was similar success report of approximately 90% in both arms. So this means that surgery is an option for treatment of gastroesophageal reflux, and there are multiple trials in such patients have been done. So at least the opportunity to undergo surgical operation for reflux be offered to the patients with GERD. So how that anti-reflux surgery control GERD? The principle is that we have to make a strong barrier between stomach and esophagus so that the gastric contents don't go back into the esophagus. So by creation of floppy valve, by close opposition between esophagus and gastric fundus, so when we wrap fundus around the esophagus, then this floppy valve is created. When we wrap that fundus around the esophagus, then the angle of his also become exaggerated. So this is the second point. And when we do fundoplication, the basal tone of the lower esophageal sphincter is increased. And Now there will be no fundus, so there will be decreased gastric distension. When there will be decreased fundal or gastric distension, then there will be decreased incidence of transient lower esophageal sphincter relaxation, because the instigating factor for transient lower esophageal sphincter relaxation is gastric distension. So by that reflex surgery, now there is no gastric distension. So automatically transient lower esophageal sphincter relaxation will reduce in number, and that will help these patients with GERD. And again, when we will wrap stomach around the lower part of esophagus, so the thin part of the lower esophagus will be no more and it will become more strong. So the advantages of surgery are clear, because it does not treat the cause, rather it does not treat the effect. It rather treats the cause, that the factors that were involved in causing gastroesophageal reflux disease, we are going to treat that cause. And again, if there is a duodenal fluid, because it is still not proven and it is controversial whether duodenal fluid leads to adenocarcinoma of gastroesophageal junction, or only acidic reflux leads to adenocarcinoma of gastroesophageal junction. So if it was found that it is the duodenal fluid that is involved in etiology of adenocarcinoma of esophagus, then obviously anti-reflux surgery will be preferable to PPIs only, because the PPIs will treat only the acidity, but it will not treat the bile reflux or the duodenal reflux. So there are different techniques of anti-reflux surgery. Anti-reflux surgery started like 80, 90 years ago. At first, operations were done from thoracic approach, then from abdominal approach, and now laparoscopic, and now work is being done on endoscopic approach. So the most common operation, and that is still being done, that is Nissen fundoplication, then is posterior partial fundoplication and anterior partial fundoplication. So in Nissen fundoplication, we have 360 degrees of wrap around the lower part of esophagus. This is a picture of posterior partial fundoplication, that is also called Toupet fundoplication, and that covers the posterior part of the esophagus. And different comparative studies are done that which option is good, the partial fundoplication or total fundoplication. So the complication of partial fundoplication are a bit lower as compared to total fundoplication, but in terms of recurrence, these partial fundoplication leads to more recurrent cases as compared to complete fundoplication. This is the door fundoplication. This is the anterior fundoplication. This is also a nice fundoplication, but it is done mostly in those patients in whom we treat eclasia by doing myotomy, and we cover that myotomy with anterior flap of fundus. The newer procedure that is being done in the West, and that is pretty straightforward procedure, and it can be done as a day case surgery, and that is Links procedure. Links procedure, this is, as you can see, it's a string of beads, titanium beads, and that have magnetic core. It is just wrap around the lower part of the esophagus or gastroesophageal junction, and it helps in treating gastroesophageal reflux disease, but it does not have long-term studies, and the only study that is being done has 44 patients. So long-term outcomes are still awaited. Endoscopic procedures have been tried in last couple of decades, but with passage of time, all these endoscopic procedures failed because they never followed the basic principles of surgery, that is the anti-reflux. They did not take care of anti-reflux mechanisms, because the anti-reflux mechanisms are the mechanism that underpin the success of treatment for gastroesophageal reflux disease. So now one of the procedure that is being done is transoral incision-less fundoplication. And in this procedure, they are to some extent following these principle by exaggerating the angle of his, as you can see, and also by approximation of fundus to the lower part of esophagus, so that there is compression of distal part of esophagus. But again, there will be no, they can't do lengthening of the lower part of esophagus. And if there is hiatus hernia accompanied with the GERD, then for that they will be needing laparoscopic assistance also. But it's a nice procedure, and it's a daycare procedure. Patient can be sent home in the evening. So the other is Isofix. It was also same procedure, but it did not follow the principles of accentuation of the angle of his. So the company has now stopped production of this stapler. Another topic that is very important from surgical point of view, and that is associated with gastroesophageal reflux disease, and especially the patients who come to the surgical clinic or who are referred to the surgeons do have hiatal hernia always, because GERD patients are not that common in surgical clinic. So hiatal hernia is also a common condition, and 10 to 20% of people do have hiatal hernias. And the risk factors are that with increasing age, the incidence of hiatal hernia increases. In obese people, again, hiatal hernia is common. And in males, there is more predisposition for hiatal hernias. And in families who have hiatal hernias inherently, then in first degree relative and second degree relative, hiatal hernias are common. So there are two main type of hiatal hernias, or hiatus hernias. These are sliding hiatal hernias and paraesophageal hiatal hernias. If you see on the leftmost picture, then this is the of normal anatomy, and then in the middle picture you can see this is type 1 hiatal hernia, in which the gastroesophageal junction has slightly shifted into the thorax. So this is sliding hiatal hernia. Type 2 is pure paraesophageal hernia, in which fundus of the stomach has gone up along with esophagus into the chest. Type 3 is when there is combination of sliding hiatal hernia and paraesophageal hernia. And type 4 are the giant hiatal hernia, when the defect size is more than 6 centimeters, and the other viscera also go along with stomach, like transverse colon or other viscera. These patients present with epigastric pain, heartburn, and postprandial fullness. And sometimes they also have atypical symptoms like iron deficiency, anemias, or because of gliding of gastric mucosa across gastroesophageal junction or across the crust of the diaphragm, and it causes erosion of gastric mucosa. These erosion may lead to chronic blood loss and then iron deficiency, anemia. At this point, sometimes ulcers are seen, and these ulcers are called Cameron ulcers. In acute settings, if a patient has come with incarcerated hiatal hernia or strangulated hiatal hernia, or if there is obstruction, then there can be air fluid level in the chest, or retrocardiac fluid level can be seen on chest X-ray. On barium swallow, again, we can diagnose hiatal hernias. Manometry is done to rule out eclasia and other motility disorders before going for surgery. Upper GI endoscopy is again of prime importance because it tells us about type of hiatal hernia, and also it is sometimes helpful in reduction of hiatal hernia in emergency settings, and it has also an important role in ruling out other pathologies. So the operative indication for hiatal hernias is that all type 2 hernias should be repaired, because just like inguinal hernias, paraumbilical hernias, type 2 hernias are pure paraesophageal hernias, and they can be incarcerated or strangulated. So these patients should be offered elective repair of hernia. Consideration can be given for type 3 hernias, whether they have symptoms or not, because again, they have paraesophageal part and it can result in obstruction or strangulation. Only in case of elderly people, we must be watchful because it's a big surgery and there may be complication along with it. So in elderly population, if they are not that symptomatic and they are having multiple comorbids, then we can have conservative treatment. So what are the principles for paraesophageal hernia repair? Is that we first of all reduce the contents of hernia, just like other hernias, that we completely excise the hernia sac after reduction of the herniated stomach or other viscera. And along with it, we must dissect at least 2 to 3 centimeters of esophagus and pull it down into the abdominal cavity, because if there is shortened esophagus, then it will lead to recurrence of gastroesophageal reflux symptoms, and also migration of that fundoplication wrap into the chest. And that will be very painful for the patient, and it may result in dysphagia. And along with this, we also repair diaphragmatic hiatus by doing hiatoplasty. We will see this in video. So this is one of our patient who had only atypical symptoms of repeated pneumonia, and he was 60 to 65 years of age. And when we put the scope in, half of the stomach was in the chest. So we pull the stomach down into the abdominal cavity, then excised the herniated sac, and then did hiatoplasty, and followed by nascent fundoplication. So this is already been discussed. So this is one of the video. Sound. वो साउंड चालू जी.
उसके तीनों को एक ही बना दूंगा मैं, खुशहाल हो जाएगा और एक उसका सिर्फ ओबेसिटी पर ही वैल्यू आती है, ओबेसिटी पे किया ना बस उसका जवाब, बाकी तो दिए चॉइस ऑफ मेडिकेशन इसको सब दे देना और बाकी ये इंटरनल रीडिंग कर सकता है और अपनी स्पेशलिस्ट और अपनी स्पेशलिस्ट इंटरनल स्टैंडर्ड मेथड्स ऑफ इंटरनल रीड हो रहा है मतलब उसको भी जाए देखिए अंदर से अगर सीधा सा
on the fire.
इंटरनल रीड इंटरनल सर्जरी इसी की बात कर रहे हैं, इंटरनल रीडिंग तो टेक्निक है, सर्जिकल टेक्निक है। ये मजेगा नहीं ये है ना इस तरह
महंगी नहीं है.
इसे भी मैं देख रहा हूँ बातें इस पर
आप
सीधे चल गए
even can ask me to say
जल्दी देखो कर देंगे कितना आसान काम कितना आसान हो
सिलाई मशीन. ये लेन इसको बनाना है अच्छे को.
उसके अंदर आ जाएगा वो जो बोल रहे हैं। आप चाहे तो वो कर लें। Thank you very
Okay,
much.
thank you very much.
Yes, over.
And now if you have any questions, then we can discuss that.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Suhaib, for a beautiful demonstration of the surgical technique and elaborating all the indications, the pathophysiology, and the options for treatment. So we got some questions on the chat box, and a few questions have been raised by Dr. Kushal Khan, and one of the questions, as he has asked, what results have your practice shown for obese patients with medically resistant GERD? So, would you like to elaborate further on that?
So, in obese patients, if they qualify for bariatric surgery, and in these patients, then the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass or one anastomosis gastric bypass is okay. And with one anastomosis gastric bypass, if the hernia size is not more than 4 centimeter, then we don't do any hiatoplasty. But if it is big, then we just apply a couple of stitches on the hiatus and do Roux-en-Y gastric bypass or one anastomosis gastric bypass. But in GERD patient, sleeve gastrectomy is not indicated because these are the patient whose symptoms get worse after sleeve gastrectomy.
So, the other questions have been, I think, answered in the presentation as well. But he has just asked, is there any choice of medication for bile reflux esophagitis? I think that's what he's referring to, the duodenal fluid reflux.
One thing is that for bile reflux, first of all, we must confirm whether or not it is bile reflux esophagitis. And for that, as I said to you, that we need to do either multi-channel intraluminal impedance studies or Billy-Tech test. And for bile reflux, again, there is no medicine. And for that, we have to make a strong anti-reflux mechanism. And for that, we need Nissen fundoplication.
So, Dr. Varakazi has asked a question basically which states that in an older patient, like 65 years old patient with comorbid hypertension, hiatal hernia for nearly 30 years, so which has increased in size with the incidental finding of cholelithiasis. So that must be a recent one. Both the condition present with similar symptoms, as we know. So how would you comment on the morbidity post-surgery and quality of life if laparoscopic hiatal hernia repair with cholecystectomy is done versus an open surgery? So what is your take on that?
If it is straightforward cholecystectomy and we don't have to go for CVD exploration, or there is no suspicion of choledocholithiasis, then I think it's a straightforward operation. We can do cholecystectomy and we can do hiatal hernia repair laparoscopically.
Okay, and Dr. Zishan Razak has asked, which laparoscopic energy device do you normally use for these procedures?
So, although recommended for upper GI surgeries is that we use that ultrasonic scissor, but here in Shifa Hospital, we use LigaSure. Although harmonic is preferable in upper GI surgeries and LigaSure is preferable in lower GI surgery.
We have both type of energy devices available, so it also becomes a sort of practice, a choice of the surgeon who is doing these procedures. So we are using both. And another question is by Dr. Raza Zubair Khan. Does sleeve gastrectomy show any indication of increased risk for hiatal hernia in your practice?
Sleeve gastrectomy, yes, you are right, but actually sleeve gastrectomy leads to increased risk of GERD, not hiatal hernia. And in patient with hiatal hernias, sleeve gastrectomy should preferably be not done.
Yeah. And another question is by Arham Yahya Rizwan Khan. What are the possible complications of anti-reflux surgery? I think
yes, this is a good question, and we did not discuss it. We should have discussed it. One of the common complications after anti-reflux surgery is that patient do have dysphagia, and most of the time it is temporary dysphagia, and it is relieved in a couple of weeks. But if the dysphagia is not going to be relieved, this means that we have made the hiatus very tight. As you might have heard in my commentary over the video, that we have to keep the hiatus loose so that the esophagus can easily glide in and out. So if we have applied more than required stitches on approximation of both the crura, then in these cases dysphagia may result. And if it is picked, if a surgeon thinks that he has made the hiatus very tight and he picks it early by asking the patient that is he having dysphagia, then he can take the patient back to operation theater and just to cut that stitch off. And if it has been noticed after 3 to 4 weeks, then only esophageal dilatation endoscopically is indicated, and most of the time it is very helpful. There is no need for second surgery.
So thank you, Dr. Suhaib. And it has been quite an interesting, I think, participation from the audience as well. As a general surgeon and as a trainee and as a surgeon, I recognize and I really recall that throughout our training and afterwards, we thought that the treatment of GERD is now mostly medical and surgery for most of the ulcer diseases, most of the the symptoms of reflux have been taken care of by medication. But I think with the advent of minimal invasive surgery, so more and more areas of exploration have been done, and over time we have realized with the specialized interventions that the areas which we thought that they are sort of out of bound of surgery and probably do not require surgery are now again coming up in the indication for surgery because of the minimum morbidities, because of the early return to work, and because of more effective management of these diseases. And GERD is, I think, one of them. And at least in our country, I would say we find it a renaissance in the upper GI surgery, that more and more cases of surgical management of GERD are coming up, and people are getting relief for a very, very long time, rather than relying on the medical management and just having a compromised, you can say, a life which they're spending. And every day or every week or every now and then, they suffer from the symptoms of GERD, and they are not effectively or permanently cured. So this is an area which I think, which is an exciting area for the young surgeons, for the trainees, and for the people who want to explore more and more in their surgical careers. So as you might have seen in the video, that at least with the you can say introduction of more effective devices for suturing, the intracorporeal suturing appears to be quite simple now, as you would have seen in that video, and the procedure might finish early, and the patient goes home in a very short span of time, in a day or so, and he goes back to his work quite early. So this topic, I think, and for the discussion which we have done today, must be interesting, as is seen from the active participation of the audience. And I'll conclude by saying that this must have been a topic which might raise further questions and further incentive for further exploration, for further studies. And that's what the aim of all these grand rounds is. It settles few questions, it answers few questions, and it might pave way for more discussions in future. And we will be having further grand rounds in the same connection, or on some other topics, inshallah, in future, in our specified time period, as we have. With the COVID-19 pandemic situation has given us an opportunity to go on a webinar, you can say presentation, which has basically shown more areas and more, you see, the boundaries are now crossed, and actually this grand round is international because there are many participants from across the world as well. And we thank them all on behalf of the Shifa International Hospital, our Department of Surgery, and Shifa Tamira Millat University. So, and thanks to the organizers of this CME activities, and you can all claim your certificates, which will be delivered to you after the feedback forms which are filled up. And once again, thank you from our department, and I thank Dr. Suhaib Khan as well. So we end up with the dua. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wal asr innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amilus salihati wa tawasaw bil haqq wa tawasaw bis sabr. Thank you very much.